For years, people who were in the room that night told the story differently. Some said Duke Ellington stopped the music out of respect. Others said it was something closer to fear. It happened inside a concert hall in the early 1960s, during a performance by Duke Ellington and his orchestra. 14 musicians, sharp in matching suits, working through a set that had been rehearsed and refined over weeks of touring. The hall was full. The kind of full that meant people standing along the back wall, ushers leaning against door frames, the air slightly too warm from the press of bodies in wool coats during a cold month. Ellington's orchestra was, by this point, one of the most precise and celebrated ensembles in American music. A band that had been together, in one form or another, for over 3 decades, playing arrangements so familiar to the musicians that they could be performed almost without looking at the charts. And then, in the middle of a number the band had played hundreds of times before, Duke Ellington raised his hand. The music didn't end gradually. It didn't taper off the way a song sometimes does when a band leader signals a soft landing. It simply stopped, mid-phrase, mid-breath. The kind of stop that, in a room full of trained musicians, registers before the audience even fully understands what happened. For a few seconds, 14 musicians sat with their instruments still raised, looking not at Ellington and not at each other, but out into the darkness of the audience. To understand why that pause mattered and why it would be remembered, retold, and argued about for years afterward, it helps to understand exactly where Duke Ellington stood at that moment and who else was sitting in that hall. By the early 1960s, Duke Ellington had spent more than 30 years building one of the most respected institutions in American music. His orchestra wasn't simply a band. It was closer to a living archive of compositions, a group that had premiered some of the most ambitious orchestral jazz ever written, performed for royalty, for presidents, for audiences in concert halls that, a generation earlier, would never have booked a black orchestra at all. Ellington himself carried this history with a kind of quiet formality. He dressed immaculately. He spoke in careful, measured sentences, often turning even simple observations into something that sounded composed in advance. Those who worked with him described a man who rarely, if ever, appeared rattled. A band leader whose calm was so consistent that musicians sometimes joked it was its own kind of instrument, something he conducted the room with as much as his hands. But there was one name that, according to those close to him, could still make Duke Ellington pause, and that name belonged to Louis Armstrong. The relationship between Armstrong and Ellington was, by this point, decades old and more complicated than most audiences realized. They had come from different worlds within the same music. Armstrong had built his career on the small, fiery ensembles of New Orleans and Chicago, bands where a single trumpet could carry an entire arrangement, where the music lived in the moment, in the solo, in the individual voice cutting through. Ellington had built his career on the opposite instinct, the orchestra as a single instrument, 14 or 15 musicians functioning as one extended, layered sound, with Ellington himself often barely visible at the piano, more architect than soloist. For years, critics and fans had sometimes framed the two men as representing different, even competing, visions of what jazz could be. Armstrong, the instinctive showman, all warmth and immediacy. Ellington, the composer, all structure and ambition.
Magazine writers occasionally tried to manufacture a rivalry out of this contrast, asking each man in interviews to comment on the other's approach, as though one of them had to be declared the rightful heir to the music, and the other a kind of beautiful detour. What audiences rarely saw was how much each man actually thought of the other. Armstrong had grown up listening to bands like Ellington's with something close to awe, orchestras that could do, with 15 musicians and years of rehearsal, things his smaller groups never could. He spoke, on the rare occasions he was asked seriously about Ellington's music, with the kind of careful respect he usually reserved for the musicians who had taught him as a young man back in New Orleans. And Ellington, for all his composure, had spent decades describing Armstrong's trumpet in terms he rarely used for anyone else, as something close to the original source, the sound that everything in American music after it had in some way been responding to. He once suggested in an interview years earlier that without Armstrong's example, an entire generation of musicians, himself included, might have taken a different, lesser path entirely. A year or so before this concert, the two men had even recorded together for the first time in a formal studio setting, an album that paired Armstrong's small group with Ellington's compositions, a meeting that critics had been requesting for years and that both men had, for various reasons, taken a long time to actually arrange. The sessions had gone well by most accounts, relaxed, warm, full of the kind of easy back and forth between musicians who respected each other completely and had simply never found the right moment to work together. But a single album, however successful, was not the same as decades of separate careers, separate bands, separate audiences who had, in some cases, never seen the two men in the same room. On this particular night, none of that history was visible to the audience. As far as most people in the hall knew, this was simply an Ellington concert. His orchestra, his arrangements, his evening. What they didn't know was that Louis Armstrong was in the building. Armstrong hadn't been announced. He wasn't performing that night, and there had been no notice in the program, no acknowledgement from the stage when the lights went down. He had simply come, quietly, the way performers of his stature sometimes did when they wanted to hear a colleague's work without becoming the evening's story themselves, and taken a seat well back from the stage, in a section of the hall dim enough that, from where Ellington stood at the piano, individual faces blurred into shapes and shadows. Accounts differ on exactly when Ellington noticed him. Some who were close to the band that night said Ellington had been told beforehand, quietly by someone working the house, that Armstrong had come in during the opening number, a piece of information passed along the way such things sometimes were, discreetly, so that a band leader wouldn't be caught off guard. Others said Ellington simply looked up at some point during the set, the way band leaders often do, scanning the room between phrases, checking the balance of the sound, gauging how a passage was landing, and recognized, even at that distance, even in that light, the unmistakable shape of a man he had known for the better part of 40 years. The set of the shoulders, the particular way Armstrong sat, slightly forward, attentive in a way that audiences who weren't musicians themselves rarely were. Whichever version is true, what happened next was the same. In the middle of the song, Ellington's hand went up. The orchestra stopped. For the musicians on stage, the silence that followed was almost disorienting. Ellington's band was famous for its discipline. Cues were rehearsed, transitions were planned, and a sudden stop mid-phrase simply did not happen. Not in a hall this size, not in front of an audience this large. Several of the musicians later admitted they assumed something had gone wrong. A broken string, a missed cue, perhaps even a problem with Ellington himself, who was, after all, not a young man anymore, and who had, on rare occasions in recent years, needed a moment here or there during long performances. They turned instinctively toward the piano, ready to follow whatever signal came next, a restart, an apology gesture, anything that would explain the break in a set they had played dozens of times without incident. And then, following Ellington's gaze, they turned toward the audience instead. For a few seconds, 3, maybe 4, though those who were there remembered it lasting much longer, nothing happened. Ellington stood at the piano, one hand still raised, looking out into the dark hall. The audience, sensing something unusual but unsure what, began to quiet in the way crowds do when they realize they're missing information that everyone on stage seems to have. A few people near the front turned in their seats, trying to see what the musicians were looking at, but for most of the hall, the audience itself was simply a wall of shadow, impossible to read from the stage, and impossible for most of the crowd to know that they themselves were, for a moment, the subject of the silence. This is the moment that, in the years afterward, became the center of the story, and the moment people who were there described so differently. Some said Ellington's expression in that pause was one of simple recognition, the look of a man who had just spotted an old friend in a crowd and, for a moment, forgot he was in the middle of a performance. A small, human lapse, quickly composed, nothing more. They described it almost fondly, the way you might describe a colleague pausing mid-sentence because someone unexpected walked into the room. Not a crisis, just a brief, very human interruption of an otherwise polished evening. Others, and this was the version that circulated more quietly among musicians rather than audiences, described something closer to nerves. Not stage fright in the usual sense. Ellington had performed in front of far larger and more important audiences without hesitation, had played for heads of state without so much as a missed beat. But there was, those musicians said, a particular kind of self-consciousness that came from realizing, mid-performance, that the person you most wanted to play well for had just walked into the room unannounced, and that for a few seconds, Ellington wasn't sure whether to continue exactly as planned or to do something else entirely. One musician, asked about it years later, put it simply: everyone in that band had played for kings, but there was only one man in the building that night whose opinion Ellington seemed, in that moment, to actually be thinking about. What Ellington did, in the end, was neither entirely one nor the other. He lowered his hand, turned slightly toward the orchestra, and said something to the musicians nearest him, quiet enough that even those a few seats away couldn't make out the words. Then he turned back to the piano, and instead of picking up the song exactly where it had stopped, he began something else. A short passage, almost an introduction, slower than what had come before, the kind of phrase that in Ellington's hand often functioned as a signal to the band, a way of saying, without words, that something had changed and that everyone needed to listen for what came next. The orchestra followed him into it, carefully, the way a band does when they trust their leader completely but aren't yet sure where he's going. And what followed, for the next several minutes, was not the song that had been interrupted. It was something closer to a tribute. Fragments of melodies associated with New Orleans, with the earliest era of the music both men had spent their lives playing, woven into Ellington's own arrangement in a way that felt, to those who recognized it, less like an interruption of the program and more like a private message sent across a dark concert hall to one listener in particular. Whether Louis Armstrong understood in that moment exactly what was happening, whether he recognized the fragments, the gesture, the meaning behind a sudden change in a program he hadn't even known he was attending, those close to him later said he did. Armstrong, by every account, sat very still during those minutes, in a way that those near him noticed even in the dark, his usual restless warmth replaced by something quieter, more attentive. The posture of a man listening to something meant specifically for him. When the orchestra finally returned to its regular program, the audience applauded, sensing only that something had happened, without being entirely sure what. The rest of the concert continued as planned. Ellington never mentioned Armstrong from the stage. Armstrong never stood, never waved, never did anything that might have turned the moment into something the rest of the hall could see. Afterward, the story began to travel, first among the musicians who had been on stage, then among those who worked at the hall, then, slowly, into the wider world of people who followed both men's careers closely enough to hear it. And as it traveled, it split, the way stories often do, into two versions. The respect version, the nerves version. Both, in their own way, were true. What the story revealed, more than anything else, was something about the actual relationship between these two men, one that had little to do with the rivalry critics sometimes constructed between them, and everything to do with a kind of mutual respect so old, so settled, that it could surface in a single unplanned gesture, mid-song, in front of thousands of people who had no idea anything unusual was happening. The two men represented, to much of the public, two different chapters of the same story: the soloist and the composer, the riverboat and the concert hall, the past and the present of a music that was still, even then, inventing itself. But to each other, they were simply two musicians who had spent their whole lives in the same conversation, even when they were standing on opposite sides of it. Duke Ellington spent his career building structures, orchestras, compositions, arrangements so detailed they could be performed decades later exactly as written. Louis Armstrong spent his career trusting the moment, the note that arrived because it was true, not because it was planned. On this one night, in a concert hall that never made it into either man's official history, those two instincts met for a few seconds in the dark, not as rivals, not as representatives of competing eras, but simply as two old friends, one of whom had just realized the other was listening. And for those who were there, that brief, unexplained silence, 3 or 4 seconds that the rest of the audience barely noticed, remained, for the rest of their lives, one of the clearest memories they had of either man. Not because of what was said, because of what wasn't.